Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I'm here once again with Professor Larry Cottabacker, and we are talking about Hong Kong between one country and two systems. Today, we will be discussing Chapter 7, Stop the Storm and Restore Order, a warning about criminal elements, the Black Hand, and the corruption of the patriotic education of the young. This was written August 7th, 2019. How are you doing today, Professor Backer?
Very well, and eager to talk a little bit about this chapter. But hopefully, in this talk, it'll be more a tease than digging deep, because I want you all to read the chapter. So I'm going to be teasing you, hopefully enough, and maybe provoking you a little bit, so that you're going to want to go and read the chapter in its entirety.
Personally, for me, I mean, reading the chapters, they're so deep that I don't think you could dig deep enough in these interviews, so I just want people to go out and buy the book as well. But
Yes.
I guess the first thing we're going to talk about, you say stop the storm and restore order. And some of this chapter is based off of statements coming from the Hong Kong Macau Affairs Office. And I wanted to ask you about the way in which they may have been constructing meaning. And we may have talked about this in prior chapters. And by constructing meaning, I mean constructing what the people are supposed to see when they see this resistance group and protesting.
All right. Yeah. No. And actually, this is really interesting. At the time, of course, and that's what makes the essays kind of also interesting in their own way. At the time, you didn't realize what was going on. Because of course, no one could tease out where all of this was ultimately going to go. But this period between late July and early August, in retrospect, is a period where all of the elements of the central authorities' discursive campaign against both the protesters and protester group, with respect to their relationship to the local authorities, and then ultimately with respect to the international communities, the international intellectual elite, the political elites, economic actors, and the like. And we'll see that very soon with the chapter that discusses Surya Deva and the application of human rights norms to corporate activity in the context of the protest, but that's coming. But this period from late July to early August is one where all of the tropes begin to be seen, and to be seen in a quite effective way. They're refined after this and they're utilized, but in a sense, when you look at both the justifications and the interpretation of what becomes the national anthem and national securities laws, you see its genesis, discursively at least, here in these early chapters 4, 5, and 7, and then of course the dilemma for Chinese intellectuals in chapter 6. And so in this case, the title itself was kind of quite telling. Stop the storm, restore order. This becomes a theme, a kind of drumbeat. Boom, 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 boom. Stop the storm, restore order becomes the underlying, the baseline of what becomes the Chinese position, and it does not change. Everyone else is squirming around, and there's lots of subtlety and the like, but this ostinato, this baseline, really begins to develop what I think, in retrospect, of course, at the time I didn't know this, a hugely powerful discursive foundation that comes. The imagery of the storm, of stopping the storm, of chaos, right? The need to restore order, and the order is not going to be restored by the masses on the street. The order is going to be restored elsewhere, right? And the choosing sides, that is, are you going to be part of the group of people who are going to continue to produce the storm, or are you going to be part of the group of people who are going to restore order, becomes critical. And from here, we don't see it here yet, but we will very, very soon. We begin seeing the other side of the coin of stopping the storm and restoring order, and that is the embrace as a fundamental starting point for human rights discussion by the central authorities of the principles of stability and prosperity, which is drawn, of course, out of the heart of the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights as privileged over, for example, the political and civil rights of the International Covenant for Political and Civil Rights, but then distilled into what we mean by stopping the storm. What is the benefit? What is the purpose, the objective? Why is this a positive thing, right? Of stopping the storm and restoring order. We're going to see in a little bit that it is the notions of stability and prosperity from out of which one country and two systems can then be aligned and move forward for the benefit of the people. So you see that, and then of course you see the black hand.
Yes, and I wanted to get to that, but first I wanted to talk about when you talk about creating sides in this storm. What are the benefits that come with? I believe you said excising some elements of the domestic to the group of the foreign, and deciding that, or directing blame to the foreign as well. What are the benefits of that from the central government?
Okay, and here in a sense, and I could have talked about it here, although it's in the background. We have men break. Again, the discursive form, the Grigus's men break theory, or not theory, his discursive form. And what happens here, and what you begin to see, especially in this statement, and especially when you identify the black hand of the foreign, hidden, negative, dark, secret, a deceptive, manipulative, as opposed to light, straightforward, objective, forward-thinking, national, home people. And when you start constructing it this way, there's a tremendous amount of overtones, and not just overtones, of repercussions in terms of the way in which you can talk about the Hong Kong situation and one country, two systems. So when we talk about the foreign, the black hand, what we're talking about are two things. One is that, in fact, this protest is not necessarily wholly, partially, or entirely an expression of the people, and that to some extent, popular opinion has to be grounded in a sense of purity, that is, of non-corruption from outside people who are projecting their own interests in, but rather ought to be measured theoretically on the streets, but in the way this winds up, through the appropriate procedures of local and central governance, through the appropriate channels of people who are not corrupted. And from this, and indeed at the end of this, we move from notions of storm to notions of storms that are being generated in part by people who are being deceived or manipulated, or who are colluding with and therefore corrupting the internal process of autonomy. We have the foreign, and read here, not just the foreign, but the international community, and pause, ... read here a sideways attack on the legitimacy and relevance of the Sino-UK declaration from 1984, which is supposed to be the grounding international law document, and then international customary law and common law, which becomes important again later on when the rhetoric on the street begins looking at international notions of self-determination. You have that on one side. And then you have, but what about the people who are not corrupted? Those are the people for whom the local and central authorities are working. And so this distinction then creates this sense of the foreign as as not a hero in the story of the injection of international law, not just national powers like the British or the Americans coming in to advance UK or US policy, but the whole notion of internationalism as an instrument of either a decayed empire, the UK, or as Zhang Shigang mentioned in an earlier chapter, the possible conceptualization of globalization as an instrument of a Western camp to project their own views back into China. So we're going back to the mid-19th century and then the period of attack on our sovereignty. We're back to late Manchu or Qing dynasty. And therefore, right, and I'll end with this because it's all connected and complex, but not complicated. And therefore, part of stopping the storm has to be a focus on developing and ensuring what will become the great patriotic educational campaigns. It is said kind of offhandedly in this discursive statement, this just incredible discursive statement discussed in chapter 7. It's a paragraph kind of towards the end in a question and answer session, but already one can begin to see that the central authorities are targeting the educational establishment. Ironically, in ways that we see the educational establishment attacked currently in the United States with critical race theory and the formation of patriotic Americans. We have this distinction between this notion of patriotism, which will then produce the calming and stability within which autonomy and difference can be discussed within these constraints. And then you have these foreigners who are upsetting everything.
And that's what I wanted to get on next. First, I wanted to say you're absolutely right about the positioning of the forum, but it makes for an effective way of excising the protesters or those who side with the foreign from the body politic. And it seems that may allow for measures to be taken against them that otherwise would not have been seen as favorable by the populace if those measures were taken by the central government to citizens. But I wanted to ask you, what is it about the education system, especially in Hong Kong, that makes it easily attackable?
Well, for the same reason that, although in mirror reverse, that elements in the West, especially in the United States, tend to attack the American educational system as well. The drivers are very similar, in my view. And that is a sense that the educational system, it's not that they are producing incisively questioning students who are able to really wrestle with new ideas. It's that the educational system does not do part of what educational systems are thought to have to do, which is to socialize students within the political, economic, moral model of the nation in which they form a part, to appreciate that discursive meaning making, and now I'm being semiotic for a second, that discursive meaning making must proceed from a deeply embedded, a deeply encoded set of fundamental norms, patriotic norms that are meant to foster the core values that make a community distinctive, and that a chaotic or a rudderless educational system that does nothing but question, and that, suspiciously enough, has stronger ties to international currents than to national currents, to international sensibilities rather than to national sensibilities, explodes the authority, right, the coherence with which a demos is created and then argues among themselves, within their own constraints. And therefore, ultimately, from the perspective, again, the American perspective will be different than the Chinese perspective, liberal democratic versus Marxist Leninist, but the fear is the same, that the state and its core values will be exploded. And indeed, in this case, right, the central authorities say, well, this isn't just theoretical, right? Look at all the people behind you in the picture on the screen, right? And so now we worry, because we can't just take this as an expression of the mass line. People are unhappy because our bureaucrats are blundering, although there's a bit of that, right? We now can't trust that expression, because we can't trust that our educational system has deeply encoded the core of our values onto our students, right? The big fight about critical race theory and the destruction of the fabric of American coherence. They're similar, very different, of course, but the impulse, at least, springs from the same ground, and that therefore part of what has to be fixed, part of quelling the storm, has to involve a deep look at the education system. In this instance, the focus was on non-university education, but the and just to anticipate a question, but memories run long, and the universities would also likely be in the crosshairs, at least those elements of university education that might be viewed as being vanguard elements, either ideologically, discursively, or on the streets, organizationally, vanguard elements in these protests. And at this point, you see this coming out.
Okay, and my final question for this chapter has to do with the elements that are assisting in this current situation. And you see, or you hear them discussing the hidden elements. And I guess this kind of relates to the Black hand in many ways. What makes the argument of hidden elements so effective?
Oh, it's wonderful. It's delicious. I love hidden elements.
You love hidden elements.
Well, no, I hate hidden elements, but discursively,
Yeah.
hidden elements works well as a discursive trope, and a necessary one.
Yeah.
Right. It's one thing where, it's the old picture of contestants, where equally transparent, equally well-defined collectives battle discursively. We're not doing physical battle, that we can put to the side. But here, the hiddenness adds the overtones of, again, that we'd already been talking about: deception, manipulation, untruth, motives that are not disclosed. I keep saying manipulation, but manipulation, right? And that therefore, the people who are either being used, they are being duped, and therefore have to be saved from being duped, or they are self-consciously instruments of a foreign power, and that itself would call into question their approach and interpretation to two systems within one country. This is, again, not truth, but this is a truth that flows from the perspective, that flows from out of the core presumptions of Chinese Marxist Leninism. So that in that case, the hidden adds the dark elements, the manipulative and deceptive elements, right, to what is then viewed as or will come to be viewed as the use of international law and norms, and the expression by international actors of the responses or support for the protesters as being put forward not for the support of Hong Kong patriots trying to establish their own parameters for autonomy with China, but instead to use it as an instrument to detach Hong Kong from China, using the trope of global internationalism, but actually the functional result will be different. And one begins to see that larded. You have to look for it a little bit, but one begins to see it here in this context, and especially given by this point, finally, the foreign states were beginning to express views more muscularly, and that was also to some extent, the central authorities might have viewed that as a ratcheting up of the stakes of the conflict. It's not just central authorities or local authorities versus a million or so, a bunch of people on the street, a million certainly on June 9th, and then the stuff that happens later. Now the stakes are going to be higher because all of a sudden international law norms, agreements, and states willing to call the central authorities on it are now in play. And now all of a sudden something from, and here's the deal here, right? Finally in chapter 7, we're not talking about people being angry about the extradition law. Now this looks like an expansion, and it looks like stakes getting higher. But in that context, the discursive tropes that you already began to see develop by the end of July are now beginning to appear in much more coherent form.
Okay. Yeah, I really enjoyed this chapter because it felt as though, like you just said, it felt as though there was more direction from the central government at this time. And hindsight being 2020, after reading the whole book and living through it, you start to see how their choices were formed and how they decided to stay consistent, in what ways they did not really deviate from the plan from this point on. It was no longer they were trying to fill it out, trying to see what worked. They had made a decision, it appeared, from this point on.
Right, and the choice of words becomes critical.
Yes.
Because the choice of words, you've got a canvas behind you. The choice of words then paints the picture. And the language that they used was difficult to avoid, and just a little bit of foreshadowing, the discursive mistake, and a very costly one for the international community, and certainly for the protest, the constellation of protest movement, was their failure to see the power of the discursive tropes being built up by the central authorities, and their either unwillingness or inability to meet it on its own terms until it was too late.
Too late. And it was critical by the central government to ensure that they painted the picture and did not allow people to either trust their eyes or allow the protesters to paint that picture.
Right. That's right. And it became, single-mindedly put out. And again, that notion of that drumbeat, that ostinato, that's what you're hearing. It's a heartbeat. It is a ostinato, a continuum. It's the foundation. It's unavoidable. You and I can be talking about daffodils, but what we're hearing is this constantly ringing, and there's no counter movement. There's no counter noise, and that makes a huge difference. My little bit of audio here, but you do a 2-4, and then you do triplets against each other. You create a much shakier ground for discourse than if all you hear, everyone is creating a discursive environment from out of that base note.
Yeah, I totally understand. But all right, well, that completes our analysis of chapter 7. Is there anything else you would like to say to your wonderful fans?
No, just my usual. Buy my book.
And look forward to our discussion on July 13th about the book. Well, thank you for being a part of this, Professor Backer. I hope that everyone enjoyed watching this. And, well, have a nice day. You have a nice day, Professor Backer. Goodbye.